The First Amendment to the Constitution begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
One can look at earlier iterations, that is, earlier drafts of the First Amendment, to know that that word respecting an establishment of religion simply meant no national denomination or national church. Very many of the states at that time had state churches, so it was limited to Congress.
There were many Americans who wanted to disallow the establishment of a national church because they feared that a new national church would displace the existing church-state relationships that we found in the various states and at the local level.
What brought about the change in understanding from no establishment to separation of church and state, which is often interpreted as the separation of God and government?
In a 1947 court case, Everson versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court did something that was kind of unbelievable. They went back and pulled out a letter that Jefferson had written. Now, so we're perfectly clear. This was our third president, and we're now in 1947, so they went way back. It was not an act of Congress. It wasn't something that was done even in an official capacity. It wasn't even an executive order, which we know in today's world can be signed or not signed and moved along from president to president. But basically, a letter to a constituent was used to support a brand new legal doctrine that the Supreme Court essentially invented.
And it's in this case that the Supreme Court connects the First Amendment with the 14th Amendment, which begins to undermine this historic understanding of the First Amendment as a provision primarily about federalism, the separation of powers between the central government and regional governments. And so they extend the prohibitions of the Establishment Clause to the state and local level. We also begin to see a redefining of what we mean by an establishment of religion.
Cultures are won and lost over what words mean. And there's a very powerful statement by Paul Johnson in a book called Enemies of Society that is worth taking note of. One principal way in which our civilization is rendered vulnerable to assault by its enemies and its false friends is through the undermining of linguistic truth. Language is the bloodstream of a culture, the real infrastructure of civilization. There has been that notion that words can be twisted and that they are not fixed. I would say to the federal judges who adopt that attitude, they don't mean that altogether. If you were to leave off one of the zeros on their paycheck on the very next time that they were due for pay, I would submit that they were very literal interpretationists.
It is government that is restricted by the First Amendment. So we go from an amendment which in its literal language restricts government only to now being a restriction not only on government, but now it becomes a restriction on the church.
The context of Jefferson's letter is as follows. In his day, Thomas Jefferson was viewed as a champion of religious freedom, especially to those who stood outside of the established church. When Jefferson became the third president, he was a hero to evangelical groups around the country. In 1801, a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, wrote to him to cheer him on and also to make sure their rights as nonconformists in a state church, the Congregational Church, would not be denied. On January 1st, 1802, he wrote them,
"Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only, and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Thomas Jefferson.
And that phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, of course, has been extracted from the letter and has become, in the minds of many Americans, including many Supreme Court justices, as synonymous with the First Amendment.
In Jefferson's letter, he went on to say that this whole measure was on behalf of the rights of conscience. He ends the letter with a request for their prayers to God.
I reciprocate your kind prayers for the protection and blessing of the common Father and Creator of man, and tender you for yourselves and your religious association assurances of my high respect and esteem. Thomas Jefferson.
Some critics note that the very letter that gave us the separation of church and state concept technically violates the separation of church and state as often understood today.
This is a letter that not only ends with a request for prayer, but it begins with a series of profoundly theological propositions. He begins the letter speaking, believing with you that religion is a matter that lies solely between a man and his God, right? He begins with a theological proposition. So this is a letter that's drenched in theology and a religious reverence.
What has been the effect of this reinterpretation of the First Amendment by the Supreme Court?
They said, we are going to install this concept of the separation of church and state. And what it really turned into was judicial censorship. The courts would be able to decide when was an acceptable level of religion and when did it go too far. And over these last years, since that ruling in 1947, it's been a nonstop stream of cases where the court tries to balance. And if you really look at it, it's sheer censorship. We, the court, will decide when you've crossed the line.
If you read the letter in the context of Jefferson's other commentaries on church-state relations under the First Amendment, what Jefferson was doing is he was erecting a wall of separation, not generally between church and state, but he was erecting the wall between the national government and state governments on matters pertaining to religion. But that distinction has been lost in the modern mind and in modern jurisprudence. And I think in the last 75 years or so, we've seen this idea being used to promote a kind of coerced secularization of public discourse, political discourse in this country. And it is pushed to the margins, I believe, people of faith and ideas of faith. And I think that has not been healthy for American democracy.